Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. The Truman and Eisenhower administrations led the nation to make social, economic, and political adjustments following World War II. During the 1950s, also, the economy boomed, and a lot of Americans enjoyed the American dream, an idea that's largely shaped by the 1950s and our memory of it. But for all of that American dream, the dream also came with a marked income gap between affluent and non-affluent people. So, dear students, incline your ear and hear our stories that you might find your place among his delights. We have three objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to identify economic and social problems that Americans faced after World War II. You should be able to describe the causes and effects of political conservatism and social unrest in the post-war period. And you should be able to explain how the white migration to the suburbs created an urban crisis. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 11. Here I want to talk about how the economy handled all of the returning servicemen and how we go from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy and also a wartime society into a peacetime society. And I think we have to begin with our discussion of the GI Bill, because in the summer of 1946, around 10 million men and women had been released from the armed forces and were coming home. And to return to that civilian life was a pretty marked change of life after years of serving overseas. And to ease that transition, Congress passed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, also known as the GI Bill of Rights, in 1944. It encouraged American veterans to go get an education by paying part of their tuition, but also the GI Bill guaranteed them to a year's worth of unemployment benefits while job hunting to make it so there was less likely to come be a homeless vet when people came home. It also offered low-interest, federally guaranteed loans, and millions of young families used these benefits to go buy homes or farms or establish new businesses. I really think the GI Bill is one of the important pieces of American public policy with dealing with, stateside post-war issues. It's still in force today and still a successful program. Subpoint B. From 1945 to 1946, returning veterans faced a severe housing shortage. A lot of families lived in cramped apartments or moved in with relatives. This was the early days of the baby boom, and it was hard to find, places for all of these babies, which were booming all over the place. In response to the housing crisis, developers like William Levitt used efficient assembly line methods to go mass produce houses. Levitt, who bragged that his company could build a house in 16 minutes, offered homes in small residential communities surrounding cities. These were called suburbs. They're not a brand new creation in the 1950s, but kind of, and they would do it for pretty inexpensive numbers. About $7,000 could get you a new home in the suburbs. No, it's $7,000 in $1940, but even that's a pretty affordable amount. Levittown was Levitt's first post-war development on Long Island, where standardized homes built in rows of treeless lots. The homes looked exactly alike, and zoning laws meant that they would stay exactly the same. Americans loved the openness and small-town feel of the planned suburbs. Levittown would also come with some interesting racial baggage, which we'll deal with in a future episode. Subpoint C. Here I want to talk about the modern family of the post-war era, because tensions were created by all these changes in men's and women's roles during the war and after the war, and it contributed to a pretty fast divorce rate. Traditionally, men were the breadwinners in the family and the heads of households, while women were expected to stay home and care for the family. During the war, though, those things changed, and about 8 million women, 75% of whom were married, entered the workforce. These women supported their families and made important household decisions because they too were wage earners in the home. Many were reluctant to give up their new independence when the husbands returned and had built a life in the working world. And that was pretty tough on families. Just the transition of people coming home in general would have been hard, and then suddenly gender roles have changed, and it was tricky for families. By 1950, more than 1 million marriages had ended in divorce. Subpoint B. After World War II, the United States converted from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy and immediately canceled all these war contracts. $35 billion worth of contracts were suddenly ended. And factories that were producing bullets and planes and tanks lost their customers. They had to go switch back to making mechanical pencils and automobiles. Within 10 days of Japan's surrender, more than 1 million defense workers were laid off. And post-war unemployment peaked in 1946 as 3 million people sought work. It's worth remembering that we were in the Great Depression before World War II, and then suddenly World War II is over, and it kind of looks like we're spiraling back into it again. Rising unemployment wasn't the only post-war problem in the economy, though. During the war, the Office of Price Administration had halted inflation by imposing all these maximum prices on goods, but the price controls ended when the war was over, and by June of 1946, prices began to skyrocket. In the next 2 weeks, the cost of consumer products jumped 25%, with basically pent-up demand and pent-up price caps, doubling the increase of the past 3 years beforehand. In some cities, consumers were standing in huge lines hoping to buy scarce items like sugar and coffee and beans. Prices rose for 2 years until finally the cost of goods and the ability to produce the goods were catching up with the demand for it. While prices were spiraling upward, American workers also earned less than they had earned during the war. To halt runaway inflation and to help the nation convert to a peacetime economy, Congress eventually reestablished controls similar to the wartime controls on prices and wages and rents in an effort to just do what they could to manage the rapid inflation. Economists don't like this idea. Economists think that you get in these times of inflation, but it has to be a phase-out program on price controls if they should ever get into them at all. But it seemed like the policy needed to supersede the economic theory. Subpoint E. Most economists had forecasted a post-war depression, but they were proved wrong because they'd failed to consider how much pent-up demand there was in the economy. You also got to remember that Americans had been doing without for a very long time. In the 1930s, the Great Depression, and then suddenly you get into World War II and there's rationing and coupon books, and Americans were pretty pent up to go buy some stuff. And while there is some economic correction that comes on, we don't really see it as strong in the United States as we see it in other places because America's just had so much pent-up demand for it. People had gone without goods for so long. By the late 1940s, there was, they had saved up the money, $135 billion in savings from defense work and service pay and investing in war bonds, which were coming to maturity. And suddenly Americans had a lot of money to spend and a lot of demand to go spend it. The demand for goods and services quickly outstripped the supply and increased the production. It created all these new jobs, and the correction, the depression that it seemed like it was going to happen just right away just gets put into work. Concern over Soviet expansion kept U.S. defense spending high and people employed. So while we're not in a wartime anymore, we are in a Cold War, and you still need to be prepared in case you go to war against the Soviet Union. So defense spending, while the wartime contracts were canceled, there was new contracts coming up for the Cold War. Foreign aid programs such as the Marshall Plan provided another boost to the American economy by helping nations in Western Europe recover from the war. That helped the United States itself create strong foreign markets for its exports. Roman numeral number 12. Here I want to talk about life and politics in the post-war era, and it begins with Harry Truman. Despite his lack of preparation for the job, and truly Truman was forced into the job without much experience or practical, ability to go be a president. He just kind of had to learn on the fly. Nevertheless, though, Truman carried a reputation for being honorable and down to earth and self-confident. But most importantly of all, Truman had the ability to make difficult decisions and to accept the responsibility of those decisions. He had a plaque put on his White House desk that read, "The buck stops here," which meant that he was going to make the decisions, but he was also going to stand accountable for the decisions he made. Truman faced two huge challenges in his presidency: dealing with the rising threat of communism and then restoring the American economy to a strong footing after the war's end. Still, by 1946 congressional elections, the country's shortages of goods and the rising inflation and the post-war labor strikes, it led to the Republican Party winning control of both the Senate and the House of Representatives, really for the first time since 1928. It wasn't since Hoover's days that the Republicans had retaken the Congress. Subpoint B. Truman also put his presidency on the line on civil rights. And I think here you really get a glimpse of the bold leadership that Truman is willing to strike out and get out over maybe his own public support to do so. He'd said, "I am asking for equality of opportunity for all human beings. And if that ends up being my failure to get reelected, then the failure will be a good cause." He knew that speaking out for civil rights and for minorities along the way could cost him electoral votes, but but he says it's worth it anyhow. In 1946, Truman created a presidential commission on civil rights and asked Congress for a federal anti-lynching law and a ban on the poll tax as a voting requirement and a permanent civil rights commission up at the top would be led from Congress. Congress refused to pass these measures or a measure to integrate the armed forces. And so Congress looked like it was not acting, and Truman himself decided it was time to take action. In July of 1948, he issued an executive order that the armed forces should be integrated, that black men and white men should serve side by side, calling for an equality of treatment and opportunity in the armed forces without regard to race or color or religion or national origin. In addition, he ordered an end to discrimination in the hiring of government employees. The Supreme Court ruled that the lower courts couldn't bar African Americans from residential neighborhoods. These actions represented the beginnings of a federal commitment to deal with racial issues that I think truly are ahead of Truman's time. Subpoint C. In 1948, Truman has to stand for election, and he's going to election with an economy that looks like it's booming, but people don't have a lot of confidence in its long term. He's making racial changes. He doesn't have a Congress behind him. In 1948, Truman looks like he's playing from behind. And a lot of Americans were blaming Truman for the nation's inflation, for labor unrest. Nevertheless, the Democrats nominated him in 1948. It's fairly unusual for a party to not renominate a sitting president. It does happen. Doesn't happen very often. To protest, though, Truman's emphasis on civil rights, the Southern Democrats, a group known as the Dixiecrats, split from the mainstream Democratic Party and formed a rival party known as the States' Rights Democratic Party, and nominated their own presidential candidate, a South Carolina governor named Strom Thurmond. On the other hand, you also have another group of the Democrats that were the liberal Democrats. These were the FDR wing, when Truman wasn't a part of it. And they were also discontented. And they nominated former Vice President Henry Wallace to go lead this new, splinter group of the Democratic Party to form a more liberal progressive party. With the divided Democratic parties, opinion polls looked like the Republicans were going to saunter in and win this. And he faced that year New York Governor Thomas Dewey. New York is always an important state. It carries a lot of electoral college votes, and you have the Democratic Party shattering. Dewey looks like, he's a kind of a mainstream Republican candidate. Congress is a Republican Congress. It looks like this is the way American people are going to lead. He doesn't have a divided party like the Democrats do, and he's from a state that holds a lot of electoral seats. All the polls said, yeah, this one's Dewey's elections to win. Refusing to believe in the polls, though, Truman poured his energy into the campaign. First, he called the Republican-dominated Congress into a special session. He challenged it to pass laws supporting elements of the Democratic Party platform, things like public housing, federal aid to education, a higher minimum wage, and extending Social Security coverage. And he, calls the Republicans to go make these changes along the way, and not one of the laws passed. Then he took his campaign to the people, and he traveled from one end of the country to the other, speaking from a rear platform in a whistle-stop campaign that harkened back to William Jennings Bryan. Day after day, the president denounced the do-nothing 80th Congress as a Congress that wasn't interested in helping the American people. And it was the Give 'em Hell, Harry campaign. And it worked. He was elected in a close upset. And this is the famous Dewey defeats Truman moment. It's the 1948 election. It looked like Dewey was going to win, but it turns out that Truman snatched a victory from the jaws of defeat. Subpoint D. After his victory, Truman continued this proposing ambitious economic reforms. He called it his fair deal. So you had the square deal with Teddy Roosevelt, you have the New Deal with Franklin Roosevelt, and you have the fair deal with Harry Truman. That's a lot of deals. And it was an extension of the New Deal policies that included a proposal for a nationwide system of required health insurance and a crop subsidy system to provide a steady income for farmers. In Congress, a lot of Northern Democrats joined the Dixiecrats, the Southern Democrats and Republicans, and doing so, they defeated all the measures. In other instances, though, Truman's ideas prevailed. Congress raised the minimum wage from 40 cents to 75 cents an hour. They extended Social Security to 10 million new people and began flood control and irrigation projects. Congress also provided financial support for cities to go clear out slums and build 810,000 housing units for low-income families. The question of like slums being torn down for new public housing is urban reform approaches like this remain controversial, but that's quite a bit of new houses, new modern houses for a new modern world. Subpoint E. Despite all of these social and economic victories, though, Truman's approval rating sank into an all-time low to 23% by 1951. The stalemate of the Korean War, the rising tide of McCarthyism, it cast doubt on the loyalty of some federal employees. They became overwhelming issues, and Truman decided not to run for re-election in 1952. The Democrats nominated an intellectual and articulate governor named Adlai Stevenson of Illinois to run against the Republican candidate, General Dwight Eisenhower. He was popularly known as Ike, and that brings us to subpoint F. I like Ike. During the campaign, the Republicans accused Democrats of plunder at home and plunder abroad. To fan the anti-communist hysteria sweeping over the country, Republicans even raised the specter of the rise of communism in China and in Eastern Europe, and they criticized the growing power of the federal government and the alleged bribery and corruption among Truman's political allies. That year, California Senator Richard Nixon had been named as Eisenhower's running mate. We've met Nixon before. He was the guy that was prosecuting Alger Hiss during the spying trials of the early Cold War. And Eisenhower tapped Nixon to go be his running mate, but he only barely did so in 1956 for re-election. The government, so in 1950, Nixon had been elected to the United States Senate. So he was in the House of Representatives. He goes on to be a U.S. Senator. And he was a U.S. Senator from California. At the time, Congress would provide one round-trip ticket between Washington, D.C. and wherever, the congressman was from or the senator was from, which California was a long way away from Washington, D.C. And he got one trip back and forth a year. Now, Nixon felt that wasn't enough, and he had to go be in California to go represent his people in Washington, D.C. He had to be from California to go do so, and he needed more trips to go do so. But he had to go pay for it on his own. Congress would only provide one to go do so. In the East Coast, the transportation corridors made it where transportation was pretty cheap in the East Coast, and a senator from, Massachusetts could get back and forth between Washington, D.C. pretty easily. But California was a long hike and a pretty expensive path. And Nixon was not a rich man. He had been an attorney, but as soon as he entered public life, stepped down from practicing law. I figured that wasn't a fair thing to do, to be making laws, but also to be practicing law. I figured that was a conflict of interest, and he stopped his legal practice. So all of his income came from working in government, which didn't pay a lot of money. And he was really scrupulous about his own business investments. And Nixon just wasn't a rich man. He was a pretty humble man, economically speaking. So he needed to go figure out how to get back and forth to go represent his people. He also, long-distance phone calls were expensive. Mailing was expensive, and you need to go figure out how to go pay for all of these things. Things like Christmas cards or TV and radio time, not ads, but just, to keep in contact with the people of your constituency. Those things weren't covered, and Nixon had to go pay for it himself. Campaign funds were not that common. Contributing to the re-elect Nixon campaign, those things just really didn't exist in the 1950s. And a lot of people were suspicious that if you donated money to a politician's campaign, that you were trying to buy their votes later, trying to buy influence or special favor. Nixon was aware of that and sensitive to that. So he anticipated the conflict, and he made sure that while he needed to go solicit donations to his campaign and solicit donations to his work, he set up basically a blind system where people would contribute, but that he would never know the contributors along the way. The people working for him would do all of the thank you cards and the handouts and kind of go do the glad handing and the fundraising, but Nixon would always be kind of separated from them, so he would never get the influence on it. Campaign dollars would be for travel expenses and airmail and long-distance phone charges and communications expenses. They wouldn't be for feathering his own pocket. Still, though, to Democrats, this smelled like he was soliciting money in a dirty way, and they cried foul and tried to have him removed from Eisenhower's ticket as his running mate. Nixon responded, I think, in a brilliant way, in a 30-minute televised speech that explained, he was, grew up in a modest upbringing and just didn't have a lot of money, and he had simple living expenses. He claimed that his wife didn't wear a mink coat, which was a kind of a dig at the Adlai Stevenson, the Democratic nominee, who was pretty rich. Says, my wife doesn't have a mink coat, but she does have, his quote, a respectable Republican cloth coat. but I always tell her that she'd look good in anything. The most memorable line came at the end of a speech, and that Nixon said he had received one president that he wouldn't give back under any circumstances, a little Cocker Spaniel dog, black and white spotted. He says, our little girl, Tricia, the 6-year-old, she named it Checkers, and you know the kids, like all kids, they love the dog, and I just want to say this right now, that regardless of what they say about it, we're going to keep it. And what's known as the Checker speech, it made the vice presidential candidate look like a committed public servant, a simple family man, and a devoted husband and father. It also showed, and this is the more enduring piece, that television was now the medium of politics, superseding the radio. In November of 1952, Eisenhower won 55% of the popular vote, a majority of the Electoral College votes. The Republicans narrowly retained and captured Congress. We have the transition from all of those years of Democrats and Eisenhower, of the Roosevelt and Truman days, to Eisenhower brings in a new era of the Republican president. And that brings us to subpoint G. President Eisenhower's style of governing differed from that of the Democrats. He called for government to be conservative when it comes to money and liberal when it comes to human beings. Eisenhower favored a middle-of-the-road course and avoided a lot of the controversial issues, but he couldn't totally sidestep the persistent issue of civil rights. It had gained attention in the mid-1950s. The most significant action occurred in 1954 when the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka that public schools must be integrated to accept white and black students. There wouldn't be separate schools for white students or black students. And it happened, because in my home state of Kansas, where the Brown family, Linda Brown, tried to enroll in a white school and challenged all the way up to the Supreme Court in 1954. In 1955, a black seamstress named Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus to a white man, sparking a new phase in the civil rights movement. We're going to talk about both of these issues more in a future class. Subpoint H. Shortly after becoming president, Eisenhower pressed hard for programs that would bring around a balanced budget and a cut in taxes. Remember, it's Eisenhower's goal to be conservative in financial matters. During his 2 terms, Ike's administration raised the minimum wage, extended Social Security and unemployment benefits, and increased funding for public housing. He backed the creation of interstate highways and the Department of Health and Education and Welfare. Eisenhower's popularity soared, and by 1956 he's up for re-election and wins it. Roman numeral number 13. But for all of the wealth and like suburbs and Leave It to Beaver of the 1950s, there's also a side that I don't think gets enough attention, and that's Roman numeral number 13 of the urban poor. The 1950s are remembered as a time of prosperity. In popular imagination, the 50s are a golden era in American history, and in a lot of ways that's true. Of course, like all golden eras, there's a side you're not seeing because it had large unseen poverty. In 1959, the poverty line, which is the amount of income that a family would need in order to survive, for the poverty line was a family of 4 was $2,973. In 2020, in our modern era, it was $26,200. But in 1959, a family of 4, they said basically if you made about $3,000, you're kind of on the break even of what a family can survive on. In 1962, though, nearly 1 out of every 4 Americans was living below the poverty level. So all of the expansion of the 1950s was an uneven expansion. Subpoint B. In the 1950s, also millions of middle-class white Americans left the cities altogether for the suburbs and what's known sometimes as white flight. And with them, they took the precious economic resources and isolating themselves from other races and other classes of people. At the same time, the rural poor were migrating into the inner cities, and between the end of World War II and 1960, nearly 5 million African Americans moved from the rural South into urban areas, the places that middle-class white families were leaving. This white flight had a direct impact on poor people of all races. The cities lost people and businesses, but also the property that they owed and the income taxes that they paid. City governments could no longer afford to maintain or improve public schools and public transportation, police and fire departments, and the urban poor really suffered. Subpoint C. Most African Americans and Native Americans and Latinos in the cities had to live in dirty, crowded slums. One proposed solution to the housing problem in inner cities was urban renewal. The National Housing Act of 1949 was passed to go provide a decent home and a suitable living environment for every American family. The act called for tearing down rundown neighborhoods and constructing new, modern, low-income housing. Later, nation's leaders would create a new cabinet position, the Housing and Urban Development, to go aid in improving the conditions of the inner city. Although the dilapidated areas were torn down and parking lots and shopping centers and highways and parks and factories were constructed on those same plots of cleared land, there was seldom enough new housing built to go accommodate all the displaced people. For example, a barrio in Los Angeles was torn down to go make way for Dodger Stadium, and poor people who were displaced from their homes simply moved from one ghetto to another. There's also long-term problems of how this urban renewal ends up creating just new places where poor people are trapped. And this question of how the future should handle the disparities between wealth and poor and white and black, it's a fascinating story that's going to break out in 100 different ways, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.